Hello and welcome to the Amargi Mosaic. I'm your host, Elif Sarakan. At the Amargi Mosaic, we're piecing together conversations from Kurdistan and the Middle East, bringing you stories and insights that you might not hear elsewhere. Today, I'm joined by Salim Çevik, who is a fellow at the Center for Applied Turkey Studies at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Thank you so much for joining me today, Salim.
Thank you for inviting me.
And so we'll be talking about various elements of your research. So your research covers Turkish foreign policy, Islamist movements, and democratization as main areas. And one of the things that I want to speak about or have a conversation about in particular is the report that you and a few others put together titled Visualizing Turkey's Foreign Policy Activism. And that covers many areas that I think many people would also perhaps either not immediately know or not expect in reference to Turkey. And I thought it was interesting the way it was titled, foreign policy activism, because it also includes some of the ways in which Turkey uses its, like aid regime in some parts of the world as well, which again I think is little known. So what I want to start with is something that's very topical at the moment, which is it's been a year since Ahmed al-Shara took Damascus, toppling decades of rule by the the Assad family, or some people would call the dynasty. And your report shows Turkey as his government, so Ahmed al-Shara's government, as their main external backer. And even when Erdogan met with Trump in New York and, in the US earlier this year, earlier in 2025, Trump said, in his very Trump way that, he won't admit it, but he was the one who did it. It wouldn't have been possible without him, which I think many people who follow the region closely certainly certainly knew or was able to predict that, but I think it wasn't very widely known until then. And you write, whilst the HTS, which is Ahmed al-Shara's, movement or whatever, or however else we would describe it, whilst it's not a direct Turkish proxy, say, for example, like the Syrian National Army, its rise was only possible because of Turkey's long-standing protection that it provided, particularly in the northwest of Syria, which it continues to occupy even until today. Now we're seeing Turkey discussing training Syria's new army, and they're pushing for the integration of the Syrian Democratic Forces into that, and also establishing permanent bases, so legitimizing their military presence, essentially, or formalizing their military presence. Syria does also remain deeply fragile. Israel is expanding its occupation of many areas of the south of Syria, particularly of the Golan Heights. Obviously, there's many of the issues that we've seen in the last year by those who are linked to al-Shara's forces when it comes to the Alevi communities and the Druze communities. Also, there seems to be a stalemate in the resolution with the SDF as al-Shara and his people seem to refuse a suggestion of either a level of autonomy or federalism. And also, I guess in some ways, crucially, the state that they have taken over or that they have inherited also barely functions. What do you think? I think, firstly, what do you think of the developments in Syria in the last year? What do you think in particular, I guess, especially in reference to your report, what is Turkey's end game here? Like, are they trying to create a client state? Is their main motivation preventing a Kurdish corridor? Is it at this point also seeing kind of the hegemonic, aims of Israel? What is actually happening?
Okay, good, very comprehensive question. If you go a little bit back in the history, when the Arab uprising started in 2011, the Turkish idea was to become the hegemonic power in the Middle East by virtually supporting like-minded governments across the region. It's first in Tunisia, then Egypt, then Syria. There will be all kind of like AK Party franchises across the region. They will be ideologically aligned, politically. None of them, of course, would be client states in the strict sense of the term, but they would all accept Turkey's hegemonic position in the Middle East, and they would become Turkish allies. That was like kind of the vision that Turkey had when it supported the Arab uprisings. That failed, of course. I won't go into that history, but unexpectedly last year, after Turkey actually gave up the idea of toppling the Assad regime. I mean, this is important. When Trump says he toppled down Assad, I mean, that wasn't the game. That was given up in practice by 2016 and officially by 2021. Turkey officially recognized Assad as the legitimate governor, and Erdogan made several pleas to Assad, like, let's meet, let's go back to the old days when we had, our audience would remember, before the Arab uprisings, Assad and Erdogan had family holidays together. Let's go back to old days. Let's forget these unlikely episode, this disturbing episode. Let's get over it. Erdogan said this publicly several times, and he tried to meet with Assad several times for like more than 2 years. Assad declined. So it wasn't like Turkey was trying to topple down Assad. The Assad regime collapsed because of its own internal contradictions, because of its own internal weakness, and because of the several troubles that its external backers had at the time. Iran, Hezbollah having its own problems with Israel, Russia being tied to the Ukrainian war area. So Turkey didn't actually, I always say this, Turkey didn't topple down Assad. Assad collapsed itself. Turkey wasn't even planning to topple down Assad. But it happened. And once it happened, Turkey, of course, emerged as the most critical country because, as you quoted from the report, it was Turkey who provided protection to HTS. There is a long-standing personal history, some level of ideological convergence, and also a broad strategic convergence between the new rulers in Damascus and Turkey. And that is, they both aspire to a centralized Syrian state that controls entire region, that is more unitary, a vision that does not recognize the internal divisions or plurality of the Syrian society. So this is Turkey's own vision of Syria, which is largely informed by Turkey's own political history. In Turkey, issues like federalism, autonomy, decentralization have become kind of political taboos because of Turkey's own highly nationalist position on the Kurdish question. Because of that history, Turkey, in a way, prioritized a unitary state where all power is centralized in the capital. That's Turkey's own vision. That's how Turkey works, and that's how Turkey promotes a vision for Syria. And that's the vision that the new rulers in Damascus share. This strategic convergence is also what unites Damascus and Ankara closely to each other. This is one extreme of the vision. On the opposite side, there is Israel, which has a complete opposite version of this vision. Israel wants a completely decentralized, very weakened Syria, where the regime in Damascus controls as little as possible. It's as weak as possible, and it doesn't have a strong army, maybe a kind of a gendarmerie. So Israel wants all of its neighbors to be pretty much like Lebanon. Deeply divided at the sectarian and ethnic level, a weak army, a weak centralized power. So Turkey's and Israel's vision of Syria are like polar opposites of each other, 180% different visions. And throughout the last year, we have, in a way, what we have observed is a clash between these two visions. I mean, personally, both visions are quite at the extreme. I mean, Israel's desire to keep Syria as divided and as weak as possible is not a legitimate demand. I mean, you can't demand nation states to be as weak as possible. This is not a legitimate demand. You can try to make peace with it. You can sort out your own problems. That's fine. But the one way of doing it is not randomly bombing the capital whenever you want. That's not how you sort out your problems in a legitimate way in international diplomacy. On the other hand, Turkey's projection of its own vision, which created enormous problems in Turkish history and the Kurdish uprising that has been lasted 40 years. So that vision didn't work in Turkey. A failed vision, Turkey's attempt to project and failed vision to Syria, just so that it will also fail in Syria, is again an extremely unhelpful way of diagnosing Syria's future. So we are, in a way, unfortunately struck in two unhelpful, unstable visions for Syria, two external powers pushing Syria in opposite directions, and both in directions that are not suitable to Syria's own reality. Syria's own reality of a plural society with several internal divisions, and also a history of centralized oppression, which is in a way deeply ingrained in the society's history. So that's the main problem at the moment regarding Syria. If we go back to your question about the military, Turkey's own role on raising of Syria's military, this again part of the shared vision that Syria should be a strong centralized state with a strong centralized military apparatus. And as you rightly said, Turkey wants two roles here, wants to train the Syrian army, but also wants to have military bases. And we have also seen throughout the last year, Israel has bombed Syria's the potential military bases that Turkey is considering to build up. Preemptively, Israel has bombed these places in a way to make sure that it doesn't want Turkey to have a role in Syria's future as Turkey envisions. So these two maximalist demands, there will probably be a mid ground. I mean, Israel cannot prevent Turkey's role in northern Syria, but it's trying to keep Turkish military presence as far away possible from its own borders. So there will be I expect some kind of understanding that Turkey will have formal military bases, but they will be in the north, not close to the south. Whereabouts it will be debated. I mean, Israel probably doesn't want Turkey south of Hama. Turkey wants to be as present as possible across the entire territory of Syria. They will, at one point, I expect to reach an understanding under American guidance and mediation. And the second question that you raised, when we talk about the build-up of a Syrian military and a functioning Syrian state, the core question comes to the question of SDF and the Kurdish authority and Kurdish-led military forces in northeastern Syria. And there you said about this, the key word is integration. That was the formula agreed on March 10 between Mazlum Abdi and Ahmed El-Shara. But of course, everybody understands integration in very different ways. I mean, integration is the word that everybody loves, but everybody has different understandings of what does that mean by integration. Turkey obviously understands by integration as individual persons, like all fighters of the SDF to be integrated, or those who want to be integrated in the Syrian army, prospective Syrian army, by the way. There's no Syrian army at the moment. A prospective Syrian army, they will all integrate as individual persons by their own individual capacities. Whereas the SDF understands integration, and I think that's closer to the meaning of the word, as integrating without completely losing its own corporate structure, right? Integrating as a corporate structure, because the one that Turkey has and HTS has so far promoted as individual integration, that's actually assimilation, right? And when we talk about terms like this integration term is famous in issues of migrant communities in Europe, as you know. The debate is whether to integrate or assimilate, and assimilate means you lose your own cultural background and become part of it as an individual, whereas integrate means you preserve part of your identity but still be part of the host society. And in this case, I understand integration as without losing your own corporate structure entirely and being part of the Syrian army. So this was the debate for throughout the whole year, and this is the whole not point, the gist of the whole debate when we talk about the issues between SDF and the Damascus regime. How to integrate these forces as individual soldiers or as a corporate structure. Now, more recently, the news is that there seems to have reached a common understanding between Damascus and the SDF, and that is SDF will be integrated as three divisions to the Syrian army. So not entirely as an army. So it will be a little bit divided, but obviously not as individuals. So some sort form of a mid ground seems to have been found, and this has always been the key point in the debates. And once this problem is solved, and if it is solved, I think it would be much easier for to sort out other administrative issues. Administrative issues are easier to bargain. The economic resources, you can bargain about economic resources. You can say, okay, let's keep 10% of oil revenue in the local, and let's transfer 90% to the central administration. And the other party can say, let's make it 80 to 20. And this is open to bargaining, and you can reach a conclusion. The bigger problem was integrating the military. And if the news are correct, I mean, these are still not 100% verified, but it seems to be correct, that there is an understanding that Kurdish forces or the SDF forces, it's a bit misleading to call it as Kurdish forces because it's a multi-ethnic force, but led by Kurdish forces mostly. If SDF forces are to be integrated as three divisions, and if that is an understanding is reached there, the other issues will be easier to reconcile, I believe. So that will probably remove the biggest obstacle so far in the creation of a functioning Syrian state and the functioning Syrian army. So in that sense, I'm a bit optimistic, but still the two external powers, Turkey and Israel, continue to push Syria in unproductive and unhelpful ways to two extremes. If they, and here Americans will probably be the key player. If Americans will convince these two external powers not to disturb the creation of a new Syrian state by their own visions, I think other problems can be sorted out.
And I mean, I think there would be so much more to talk about in terms of some of the the dynamics of the political element of what the future of Syria could look like and so on. But I do want to focus on, particularly Turkey's role in these parts. And of course, in your report as well, and what would be most known by our listeners and others about the role of Turkey will be its motivation to essentially, I guess we could call it in a generalized sense, to prevent any Kurdish autonomy anywhere.
Mhm.
And recently, Hakan Fidan, in a seemingly like an end of year interview on TRT World, he said that you know the actors, the different actors that are basically stakeholders in Syria have been very patient with the SDF, but patience is running out, and that he believes that also the US and other actors will basically will take whatever measure they need to if the SDF keeps stalling. Which what I think we can take from that is that Turkey are very much pushing, particularly with the US, to pressure the SDF to concede on a more Turkish style, the more Turkish style demand. But obviously, we'll have to see when things are formally announced what that actually looks like. And this is also in the context of your report also documents Turkey's military presence across 10 different countries, from Bosnia all the way to Somalia. And these look, the details of this you know, of that presence vary as well from, a slightly more heavier or for example, in Somalia with a more, kind of aid character or like veneer, the like kind of presentation to, supposed like peacekeeping and so on in certain parts. And you also document that Turkey's military operations against the PKK in Iraq, its role in preventing Kurdish autonomy in Syria, but also note that as many people would have been following the peace initiative, or, some people are calling it the peace initiative, the peace process. Some people are calling it the steps towards a peace process. with the PKK, and that declared a ceasefire, allowing actually some breathing room, particularly in the north of Syria, but also in some parts of, northern Iraq, so South Kurdistan as well. What's, how do you read Turkey's current approach to the Turkish question across these different theaters? Because as many people may know or may not know, but also certainly comes through in both in your report and actually a lot of what you've just said is Turkey's approach to the Kurdish question is very much an entanglement of its internal policy, foreign policy. It really informs a lot of its policies internally, externally, ideologically, as well for around a century. But how do you read the current change? I think people, and the reason why I think this question is important because whether people are skeptical about this suggestion of a peace process or very hopeful and very invested, everyone does have the same question. What is this current approach and what has possibly changed? Is it reading the changes in the region? Does Turkey possibly actually genuinely want Kurdish partners or finally a settled, set in stone Kurdish submission?
Yeah, yeah, good question. I mean, when it comes to Syria, you reminded me one thing. Turkey has made four military operations inside Syria under the Assad regime, and everybody thought that Turkey's primary goal is always toppling down the Assad regime. And as I said in the previous question, that actually has changed in practice. Mind you, of the four military operations, none of them targeted Assad, and three of them directly targeted Kurdish autonomy. So this has been like the hallmark of Turkey's Syria policy until recently, that preventing Kurdish autonomy in a way trumped even over toppling down the Assad regime. It was even more important than that until recently, or probably still. The confusion comes, as you raised in this question, of this so-called peace process. I mean, you can't have a peace process with your Kurds at home while simultaneously claiming that your primary goal in Syria is preventing Kurdish autonomy. I mean, this doesn't just make sense. There's a big contradiction here. But at the same time, we keep saying, as you said, Fidan still says no to any Kurdish autonomy. He wants dismantling of the SDF, threatens of another fifth military operation. By the way, Erdogan has been threatening with this operation since 2022, like for the last 3 years. That's always on the agenda. So far, let's be honest, the only thing that has prevented Turkey from doing that is the American veto over that military operation. Obviously, Turkey has the military means and resources to crush Kurdish autonomy in Syria. It's the Americans who have so far prevented it. And now, how to make sense of this kind of unending demand or unyielding vision of an end to Kurdish autonomy. In that sense, one could even say that Turkey is more more aggressive against any Kurdish autonomy compared to Damascus. I mean, Damascus could have probably reached an understanding with SDF much earlier if it wasn't for Turkish veto all the time. So, how to make sense with this fight against Kurdish autonomy and having a peace process inside Turkey with the Kurds? There are two explanations. I mean, so far, when it was again also last year in October, suddenly Turkey's ultra-nationalist political leader and Erdogan's junior partner, Devlet Bahçeli, come up and surprised everyone, saying, starting this whole peace process and even making calls to Öcalan. People trying to make sense of where did this come out, and particularly coming from Bahçeli. I mean, how come? I mean, because Erdogan did try to make peace with Kurds a couple of times during his tenure, but once seeing that it collapsed, it hurted his own domestic political support, switched to a very ultra-nationalist position in 2015. And since then, for a decade, Erdogan has been probably the most nationalist leader of Turkey, most ultra-nationalist, and probably even one could say the one who has the most aggressive position against any Kurdish presence for a long while. He claimed that there is no Kurdish question after he said that. I mean, in 2005, he said he recognizes Kurdish question. And after 2015, he started saying that there is no such a thing as Kurdish question. If it was a matter of history. He solved the question. I mean, Kurds have no question anymore. So with this historical trajectory, what happened? Two explanations. One is seeking the change in the external dynamics. A group of people, scholars, analysts, says that Middle East is in a turmoil and Turkey is adjusting its position. The logic behind this perspective is that Turkey's anti-Kurdish stance has hurt Turkey too much in foreign policy. Because of its own aggressive Kurdish policies, Turkey's hand has weakened in Iraq and Syria, and Turkey is losing its hegemonic appeal. In contrast, by making peace with Kurds, Turkey actually could have become a bigger player in the Middle East. A Kurdish-Turkish alliance would actually make Turkey the most important country in the Middle East. So that perspective is informing these analyses. Middle East is in turmoil. Turkey needs to adjust its policies. A second group says that this is primarily triggered by domestic political calculations. It has nothing to do with the external events. They argue that for Erdogan, domestic politics is always more important than foreign policy. Erdogan's primary goal is survival. He's a survivor. He has survived several political crises. And one thing that, I wouldn't say admiring, but we have to give credit that he is surviving in a country where elections are part of the political culture. And in that sense, he is not a typical Middle Eastern autocrat that is surviving by the power of party, by the power of military, or by the power of monarchy. He is surviving for 20 years in a country where competitive elections are the norm. Unfair elections, unequal terms, but still competitive elections, where a very vibrant opposition challenged Erdogan for 20 years, but Erdogan has survived all of them. So this is hard to do. This is a big success in that sense, and this is Erdogan's primary concern all the time. This concern, this winning elections, keeping in power, is more than any other ideological concern. It's actually difficult to attribute Erdogan an ideological core. I just explained his position vis-a-vis the Kurdish question. He zigzagged so much that if you go back to Erdogan's speech, you can find very liberal, very peace-oriented statements, as well as very harsh, aggressive, military-oriented statements as well. On democratization, on gender issues, even on Islam, Erdogan has kept changing his position in relations with the West. One thing that has remained constant is that his desire to remain in power. He can subscribe and unsubscribe any ideological position very quickly and very pragmatically. So if he makes such a radical change, the second group says this has something to do with his domestic political calculations. This is not an ideological change. This is not a strategic change regarding foreign policy. It has something to do with the domestic political calculations. Now, I explained the rationale behind these two approaches. My perspective, I'm 100% fully subscribed to the second group. For me, I don't really understand how the first group explains the turmoil in the Middle East with Erdogan's shift in the Kurdish question. They point out as some kind of simultaneity. Of course, there has been October 7 events, then the toppling down Assad regime, Israel's aggressiveness, Israel trying to become the military dominant power, Israel kind of crossing several red lines, attacking Iran, bombing Qatar, an American ally in the Middle East, and a major non-NATO ally. That's Qatar's official status in American foreign policy, a country that hosts the biggest American military base in the region. So obviously, I see that Middle East is in turmoil, but I don't understand the connection between Erdogan's switch in the Kurdish question. There is no causality that they have so far explained. There is simultaneity, of course, and that raises questions if there is any relation between these two, but I don't really read how one leads to the other. But if you read events through domestic politics, if that's the main trigger, that's the independent variable, my explanation and the second group's explanation is that Erdogan wants to integrate Kurd. First of all, I've just mentioned that there is a vibrant opposition community in Turkey and there is competitive elections. That's Erdogan wants to end. And Kurds have been the most prominent, most active group of this opposition group. So he wants to neutralize Kurds. If he can switch Kurds back to his own ruling coalition, that's fine. If he can't, at least to remove the Kurds from the opposition, try to gain their neutrality. That's his primary goal, I believe. And this is very important because as we are coming to elections in 2028, Erdogan's popularity is lowest. He won the previous election by a series of miscalculations of the opposition. Opposition fielding the weakest possible candidate. And with all these things combined, and Erdogan spending money like there is no tomorrow before the elections, and an enormous election spending, they all may enable Erdogan to win the previous election, but they will not be enough for the future election. So this thing that Erdogan has been surviving in a relatively democratic context, in a country where there are competitive elections, where opposition is very vibrant and well organized. Of course, Erdogan uses all the state resources, and so the elections are not fair, but still the opposition is free to compete. So in this formula, it's becoming harder and harder to win for Erdogan. I would even say impossible. So he's trying to make a dramatic shift in Turkey's own political system. And that shift is ending the competitive elections, neutralizing Kurdish opposition, and oppressing the remaining opposition, the CHP. So CHP's presidential candidate, Mayor of Istanbul, the most important opposition politician in the country, Ekrem İmamoğlu, is arrested in March 2025 and with dubious charges. Still, we don't know. And nobody is convinced that there is a legal case going on. I mean, the public poll says that even the AK Party supporters sees this as a political move, not a legal move. So all these are, it seems to be much more, this Kurdish opening seems to be much more related to the arrest of İmamoğlu, related to Erdogan's desire to become, to make his power more hegemonic and the competitive dimension of Turkish politicians than October 7 attacks, for instance, than Israel's aggressiveness in the region. I mean, it's the links are much more obvious. Explanations are much more obvious compared to the Israel's attacks. I mean, what does it have to do with Turkey's own Kurdish opening? I mean, would Israel support PKK? It seems all too far-fetched to me. I really don't see the connection there. But here the connection is obvious. Remove the Kurds from the opposition, make a bargain with them separately from the other opposition, and crush the opposition by the remaining opposition by non-democratic ways. That seems to be a working formula. And here, how it relates to Syria is that how do you appeal to the Kurds is, of course, you have to admit Kurdish autonomy in Syria in exchange for removing the Kurds from this opposition. Okay, this seems to be the formula of Erdogan. I'm not saying that this will work. There are several issues that will connect whether it will work or not. But this, to me, this seems to be the motivation. And if I'm right in reading this motivation, how do I make sense of Hakan Fidan's statements? Two possibilities. One is bargaining. I mean, he's making excessive demands to Kurds like this all. We always showing the stick. We will attack you and etc. in order to have a stronger hand in the domestic negotiations. That could be one explanation. A second explanation could be, and here I'm being a bit speculative, I'm aware, but it could be somehow linked to the domestic struggles, internal struggles of AK Party, succession to Erdogan and etc. And Fidan trying to carve a position for himself in that struggle. I will not go into the details. Now, as I said, this is the plan. I also want to talk a little bit about this is Erdogan's plan. Also, let's look at from the Kurdish perspective, how the Kurds see this whole thing. I mean, they're obviously not a passive actor here, but you want to interrupt?
I just want to, I think that it would be really great to hear about that. when you're exploring that, the thing that I would like to ask is, you know, that's an interesting point, and many people, as you've said, also do subscribe to that camp of thinking. How does that thinking also therefore explain the the quite sudden and quite violent collapse of the previous peace process from between 2013 and 15? Because if that was a calculation, then is it that just Erdogan, was pushed to do, what happened there? If a peace with the Kurds actually makes him win domestically, why did he crush it, 10 years ago?
Yeah, great question. Actually, the same camp also makes the same arguments vis-a-vis the collapse of the previous peace process. There are two ways of reading why it collapsed. One reading says that it collapsed because the state and the Kurds couldn't reach an agreement vis-a-vis Syria. Turkish state didn't accept Kurdish autonomy there, and that's why it collapsed. The Kobani events and how Erdogan's famous statement like Kobani is about to collapse. The ISIS was on the walls of Kobani, and of course the way he has said it as if giving a joyful news like ISIS is about to capture Kobani, and some of my friends say that's the moment where peace process collapsed. If you subscribe to that reading, and of course that's a key moment where peace process was hurt severely. But it went for another year after that. And they reached an understanding, what in Turkish they call Dolmabahçe Mutabakatı, between the Kurdish representatives and the government representatives in the Dolmabahçe Palace. And Öcalan's public statements in the Nevruz, they all took place after the Kobani events. And the exact moment when it collapsed is once AK Party lost the majority in the 2015 June elections. And after that, Erdogan said peace process is over now. So to me, that's a much stronger link. I'm not entirely dismissing foreign affairs. I'm not entirely dismissing that Syria, the inability to reach an understanding in Syria was always a big problem in the previous Kurdish question as well. But what led to the collapse? The immediate reason is that Erdogan lost the elections. And he saw that this peace process is not winning him the elections. And overnight, he switched to a Turkish nationalist position. In June, he lost the elections. In July, he started to bomb PKK camps in Iraq. And he said, peace process is over. I mean, that connection seems to be quite straightforward, whereas the Syrian dimension is much more convoluted. I'm not saying it's entirely, it doesn't play any role, but after the Kobani events, a year on, the process went on. Once Erdogan lost the elections, within a month, everything has collapsed. And Erdogan was quite frank about it. He said, peace process is over now, just because he lost the elections. And that's comes to actually my second point, how the Kurds view this. Because over the years, within the Kurdish camp, there have been two approaches to the Kurdish question. One approach has been seeing this as an issue of democratization. And from this, the idea was that Turkey's Kurdish question can be solved only and after Turkey's own democracy problems have been addressed. So first democratization, and kind of like automatically it will solve the Kurdish question. That was one way of reading the Kurdish question. And that actually has located the Kurds, the Kurdish political movement, on the forefront of Turkish opposition. So the idea is that, okay, we have to first end the autocratic regime in Turkey in order to solve the Kurdish question. So we have to get rid of Erdogan. Erdogan has to be defeated, democratization should start, and then the Kurdish question will be solved. The famous moment, the most epic moment of this position is when Selahattin Demirtas said, we will not make you president, we will not make you president, we will not make you president. And that is after the 2015 elections. That's just before the peace process has collapsed. Again, my reading is that Erdogan's main reason for the peace process was to capture the presidency, to get Kurdish support for that presidency. And when Demirtas said, no, we will not support that, then there was no reason for Erdogan to keep up with the peace process anymore. If I can't get Kurdish votes for my presidential claims, why make peace with them? I become Turkish nationalist and get the support of the Turkish nationalists. And he succeeded in that. So this is one reading of it. And Demirtas has been at the forefront of this position. The second position has been, and it developed over years, to prioritize Kurdish demands on the Kurdish rights rather than Turkey's overall democratization. This has a logic of this kind. Like, okay, why is it the Kurds' responsibility to democratize Turkey? I mean, if Turkey is an autocratic regime, why it's Kurds' own duty to give an end to this? We are a minority. We can't democratize Turkey by ourselves. Why are we so committed to Turkish democratization at the expense of our rights? We are losing our rights. Our mayors are, in a routine way, are removed from their positions, all because we are at the forefront of fight for Turkish democratization. Why are we paying this price incomparable to other elements of the opposition? Like CHP doesn't pay the same price. We pay the biggest price, and CHP's support to us is always a bit questionable. They say that, okay, it's not good to remove the mayors and etc., but they're always hesitant to support our cause, whereas we are fully committed to their cause of toppling down Erdogan. Why? Instead, we can, okay, it's good, of course, Turkey becomes a democracy, but why should we pay the biggest price for that? We can still work for Turkish democratization, but at the same time, we can go on our bargaining with Erdogan at the same time and protect our own rights and interests. Kurdish rights and interests is more important than Turkey's own democratization. Or let's not say more important, but it's a separate thing. We have to focus on Kurdish rights and interests rather than Turkey's overall democratization. Now, the first group was more powerful until 2023. The group has collapsed. I think it's a noble position, and I admire that position, that it's first democratized Turkey and solve Kurdish question over this. I think it's a legitimate, moral, and admiring position. There is only one problem with that. It failed. It failed to topple down Erdogan. If it achieved to win the 2023 elections, if the opposition could win that election, that political line would have worked. And hopefully, with the opposition, there would become a more democratic Turkey, which would give Kurdish rights and interests in democratic ways, in legitimate ways, in constitutional ways, not in behind the doors bargaining, but in a public and legitimate way. It would have been wonderful. But it collapsed because it couldn't win the elections. And from that point onwards, my reading is that within the Kurdish camp, the second position is gaining strength to detach Kurdish rights and interests from Turkey's own democratization. So this position in its extreme can go to in the very extreme position, let's be part of the ruling alliance. I mean, why rather than fighting against the ruling alliance, rather than trying to democratize Turkey, let's become part of this autocratic alliance, and by that way we can make the most gains for Kurdish rights and interests. Turkey will become an autocratic country, but Kurdish identity will be recognized, Kurdish mayors will be elected routinely, there will be no political oppression, etc. Go on. This is, of course, the most extreme position. At the moment, Kurdish people, or the representatives of the Kurdish political party, raise a middle ground position. They say that, okay, they now want to bargain with Erdogan on Kurdish rights and interests, but they didn't give up their vision of a more democratic Turkey. So that's of course their public position. It's not possible to say we gave up of Turkish democratization, we accepted Turkey as an autocratic country, and we want to be part of this autocratic regime and gain the most from the autocratic regime. I don't think they can ever say this publicly. But will they follow that policy line? I don't know. If they follow this policy line, if they subscribe to Erdogan's demands, if they become a full supporter of Erdogan's autocratic regime, the calculation is correct. The calculus is correct. They will gain the most with regard to Kurdish rights and interests. That involves Kurdish autonomy in Syria as well. So Kurds will get the best if they make a bargain with the evil, I would say. If they yield to the Sultan and become part of the regime, they will gain the most. But that will and the potential of Turkish democratization. Erdogan's regime will be a permanent autocratic hegemonic regime with the support of the Kurds and Turkish nationalists at the same time. And that is kind of the big success of Erdogan, to keep Kurds and Turkish nationalists at the same political camp. If he succeeds that, if Kurds subscribe to that, then the peace process can move smoothly, and it will probably end with some form of Kurdish autonomy in Syria. That, of course, at the end of the day, is not at the helm of two politicians. I mean, the leadership of the DEM party can subscribe to this view, but their voters, will they follow them or not? I don't know that. At the end of the day, the crucial element, what will determine everything, is how much support Erdogan will be able to gather from Kurds for his own domestic political claims, for his hegemonic position, for his election in the next year, and to make Turkey more and more autocratic, less and less competitive democratic elections. If he gets Kurdish support, the peace process will move smoothly. So what I'm presenting you is two bad choices: an autocratic Turkey where Kurds get their rights, or a country where democratization fight continues, but Kurds will not get their rights and they will continue to suffer under this autocratic regime. This is we are presented with two bad policy options. I don't know what Kurds will follow, but these are the two options they are presented at the moment.
I suppose also one of the points that have come up, particularly in the last month or two, is, say the scenario of the opposition actually, being in power, and the main opposition being the Republican Party. Some of the actors within that party as well doesn't necessarily guarantee the kind of democratization that perhaps the Dem Party would also be pushing for. And, I think for some people, that came out in the CHP, so the Turkish Republican Party's refusal to join the İmralı delegation. Some people say it shouldn't be seen as such a big deal. Some people say this demonstrates or symbolizes a broader approach by the Republican Party. I personally don't know. I think it's just important to note. But I think there is that question as well. But what I do want to ask you is, because one, this is something that you explore in the report, and I also think this is not something that is widely understood or spoken about, which is this thing that you speak, that you've also noted as well, called the blue homeland doctrine, which is, in Turkish would be Mavi Vatan. So, what I want to ask is, firstly, for people who don't know, and it may be the first time that they've heard this, what is this blue homeland doctrine? And what I would like to add to that is, how does that pair up with, only a few years ago, Erdogan was at the UN holding Misaki Milli maps of saying that, Turkey, 100 years ago made a compromise by accepting its current borders, but actually the rightful borders of Turkey would include, what is now modern day, the north of Syria, parts of Iraq, and so on. So, this kind of quite neo-Ottomanist approach. What is the relationship between this neo-Ottomanism and blue homeland? Is it basically the same thing? How do we talk about that for people who don't understand? And it might explain some of the ways that they understand how Turkey operates in the region. Or can the blue homeland doctrine explain how Turkey operates in the region? Is it actually informed by that? And how does it still inform its, as you've titled the report, its foreign policy activism?
Turkey's foreign policy activism. Maybe I should say a couple of words about the report as well. The idea of the report was to bring about all different dimensions of Turkish foreign policy making in one page and in one website, and the readers could basically see the hard power elements, military elements, soft power elements, economic aid, diplomatic outreach, all of them in a more comprehensive way. And with maps and charts, and we basically aim to provide some raw data for researchers as well, so that they can, when they analyze Turkish foreign policy, they could use these raw data as well. Beyond that, and because we mentioned all these different dimensions, because Turkish foreign policy making is very multidimensional, it comprises all these hard and soft power elements, and over the years, Turkey has emphasized different elements. It kept on changing. As I said, in early Arab uprising, it was more soft power elements, more ideological appeal, and etc. And then it became financial aid became a very important element. And starting around, it's hard to define the exact starting date, but probably around 2016 to 2021-22. Turkey had a very aggressive foreign policy posture where it used military very aggressively. It positioned its military, as you mentioned in one of the previous questions, in various military bases. Turkey has long, Cyprus has a long history, but recently to Somalia, to Syria, to Iraq, several military bases, all around in Libya. This deployment, use of military power as a tool in foreign policy making to gain concessions or leverage or influence is quite recent, actually. As I said, it started around 2016 and was the dominant force for 5 or 6 years. Blue homeland doctrine was part of it, in a way, application of it all over the seas. It's a maximalist demand of Turkey's. The idea is that Turkey has. Sorry, I couldn't frame it. The sea is also part of the homeland, and Turkish Navy has to protect Turkish interests in the seas. That's why the blue homeland, and in that regard, Turkey makes very aggressive and maximalist demands vis-a-vis its neighbors regarding its own exclusive economic zones, what part of the seas actually belongs to Turkey as an exclusive economic zone. There are unsolved disputes between Greece and Cyprus regarding the demarcation of the exclusive economic zones, and Turkey has made very maximalist and I would say, legally very weak arguments, made an agreement with the Libyan government and made demands over large parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. So this was, again, at the same time when Turkey was using its own military power across the region to gain leverage. But that policy, as we also mentioned in the report, starts to get weakened in the last couple of years, in the last 2 years, particularly the blue homeland, when the EU, in a way, made a very harsh statement that there would be sanctions against Turkey if Turkey continues to pursue these aggressive navy deployments in the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkey stopped. But the blue homeland doctrine, as a doctrine, remains there. As I've just explained in the previous question, Erdogan is nothing if he is not a pragmatic, and he keeps on shifting positions. And if Turkey decides to pursue a more aggressive policy line once again in the future, the doctrine is there to be revitalized, and suddenly Turkey would go back and start to make its own maximalist demands once again. At the moment, demands are there, but they are not pursued aggressively for the last 2 years, but demands are there. If Turkey wants a more aggressive thing, if the tensions rise, Turkey will once again deploy its navy on the Eastern Mediterranean against Greece, against Cyprus, and it will become a destabilizing force in the region. But at the moment, Turkey's military aggressiveness has ended in the last 2-3 years, and the reason for that is there are resources, there are demands. As you said, Turkey wants to be the hegemon, that wants to be influential in all those regions. Erdogan talks about misak-ı milli and etc. But then there are capabilities, and the Turkey is militarily capable, but at the same time, it's economically incapable. The
Mm.
economic constraints has pushed Turkey so hard that Turkey had to reconcile with many of its adversaries in the Middle East, with Egypt, with Saudi Arabia, with United Arab Emirates. Uh, he tried with Assad, failed, but if Assad accepted, he would have made peace with Assad. And he also tried to make peace with Israel. Erdogan met with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu was supposed to visit Istanbul if it wasn't for the October 7 attacks. So Turkey, in a way, downgraded its ambitions in Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean recently for the last 2 or 3 years. This doesn't mean that it can revert back to a more aggressive policy in the future, but at the moment, mostly due to economic constraints, this neo-Ottomanic ambitions, some call it neo-Ottoman, some call it as dominating the Middle East, becoming the regional hegemon. Different names are ascribed to that policy. That policy, for the moment, is shelved, and it's silent, and Turkey is trying to reconcile with other regional leaders. And I don't want to get too much away from our discussion, but let me say a few words about the emerging regional order and how Turkey sees itself there. I think at the moment Turkey is trying to align itself more with Saudi Arabia than anything else, and in a way accepts Saudi Arabia's dominance in the Middle East at large, try to align its policies with it, and try to, in a way, create a kind of a complementary alliance with Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia has the financial resources, political power in Washington, and Turkey has the military power. And the combination of these two strengths can create a regional order. That seems to be Turkey's own vision for the Middle Eastern region, not to unilaterally dominate it anymore, because it's clear that it can't. And I think Turkish policymakers have also realized that they can't. And Saudi policymakers, by the way, they also realize that they can't dominate the region unilaterally, because they failed in Yemen, they failed in the blockade of Qatar. So these two powers are coming closer to each other and sharing a kind of a same vision of a regional order where these two powers will be the most important power holders.
I mean, I think that's a really important point, and yeah, I would love to explore that perhaps in another conversation, because I think it really deserves its own conversation. But I suppose I wonder if, despite all of its kind of narratives, particularly Erdogan's narratives, if the economic incapabilities, as you've called it, in the last few years, is also the reason for the continued trade with Israel, despite its narratives, or is there something else there? And also, I would like to. We didn't talk much about it, but one of the other things that the report really documents is just how much also Turkey's arms exports have increased in the last few years, quite exponentially, actually. And I think my understanding is that a lot of those exports have been around particularly Turkey's drone technology. And I wonder if, some of it's how, Turkey's ability or its drive to kind of do that, not even balancing act, but like playing both sides act, where it supports Hamas but still not only continues trade with Israel, but like has increased trade with Israel, has essentially refused to sanction Russia, but has provided quite a lot of drones to Ukraine. There's not many states, particularly in the region, but actually anywhere in the world, that has done that in this way. Is this driven by economic interest? Is this something else? I guess as like a final roundup, I would like to ask, like, how is Turkey able to do that, and what is the drive to do that?
Again, another comprehensive question. Just one semi-correction. I mean, technically, Turkey ended trade with Israel around last May, but in practice, all reports says that it continues.
Yeah,
It goes on,
yeah.
and I have to say that Erdogan tried its best not to suspend the trade. It was actually domestic pressure that forced his hand. He tried to. I mean, that has been his pattern with Israel, publicly lashing against Israel and going trade with Israel. This has been the pattern for more than a decade. He tried to stick with that pattern once Israel's war on Gaza started, but the public pressure was so strong that he had to formally at least suspend the trade, but the trade goes on third party means. And your question about this balancing act, we can multiply the examples. A NATO member, but at the same time tries to become a member in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, wants to be integrated in the BRICS. At least formally still an EU candidate country, member of the customs union, tries to modernize the customs union, but again wants to become part of the BRICS as well. So this is the understanding in Ankara is that Turkish interests are best served if Turkey remains as autonomous and independent as possible, rather than being part of one camp. This idea is also largely popular across the society as well. I mean, many people in Turkey appreciate this foreign policy making style, not subscribing to one camp, but having relations with multiple camps at the same time. But this policy is, everybody would love to, all states will probably like such a policy, but it's very difficult to sustain it. Turkey has, and recently Erdogan has been relatively successful in doing that. And it, of course, Erdogan has a stronger hand due to Turkey's extremely strategic location, as the Americans used to call it at one point, real state value of Turkey. I mean, Turkey is so strategically located that it, in a way, strengthens its hand vis-a-vis external actors, and it enables Turkey to maintain some level of leverage and some form of autonomy. We shouldn't exaggerate this too much, but Turkey has some level of autonomy. And arms industry is actually another way of increasing Turkish independence and autonomy. So if you are self-sufficient with your arms industry, then it's easier to become self-reliant and self-autonomous. So there's a direct connection there. So it's part of this approach. On the other hand, this defense industry is it's a niche area where the only place where Turkish economy is thriving at the moment, probably. It's the place where most resources have been poured so far, but it's also started to pay back. The Turkish defense companies are growing enormously, exports numbers are growing, so it's also contributes to the economy. So there's a military, economic, and political connection there because of Erdogan's own family's own connection to that, his son-in-law in a way being the biggest player in that area. So there's this strategic choice of investing in the defense industry. By the way, maybe I should say this, none of this started with Erdogan. The idea that Turkey should have an autonomous policy, I hear it since I was a child, and I'm older than Erdogan's power. And this was so common. As I said, this is very popular in Turkey for a very long time, and particularly after the collapse of the Cold War, this became the dominant thing. The Turkey should be militarily self-reliant is first an understanding that emerged after the Cyprus crisis in 1974, when Americans put an arms embargo to Turkey. And I read reports in the 1980s about Turkish arms industry's growth. So none of it has started with AK Party. But of course, the fruits have reaped under AK Party government because AK Party is ruling for more than 20 years. So going before AK Party is kind of like ancient history now. So anything that started before AK Party comes to fruit under AK Party government. It doesn't mean that AK Party made this strategic choice, but in a way we can say that it continued to this strategic choice, didn't harm it and subscribe to it, but it's not the initiator of this policy choice. And with growing arms industry, it also is becoming a leveraging foreign policy now, and Turkey uses this very actively in third countries, particularly in the third world countries. For instance, in Africa, by providing drones, arms support, it can gain diplomatic and political leverage vis-a-vis the third countries. Turkey actively used this in Kenya, for instance, just to give one example. So in the past, what West did to Turkey, giving arms in exchange for political compliance, Now Turkey is doing this into the third world countries in Africa, giving arms in exchange for political and economic benefits. So in a way, it's becoming a sub-imperial power. If we can frame it that way, and it's all these combined together to give Turkey more autonomy and leverage in foreign policy. Drones is like the public image of it, what made the whole defense industry thing very famous, but it's not confined to the drones, by the way. Turkish investment in the defense industry involves the Navy, involves armored vehicles, it even involves a potential the next flagship would be, if everything goes by the plan, would be a new fighter jet, fifth generation Khan. So this all is part of a larger plan to give Turkey more autonomy and leverage in foreign policy, but at the same time, economically very lucrative as well. And that economic lucrativeness goes directly to the regime personnel, to Erdogan and his close family. So it's all becoming an ecosystem benefiting each other.
Thank you so much for all your thoughts and your insights, Salim. I mean, I think I can probably speak for any of our listeners where, understanding particularly some of the actions and some of the ways Turkey operates both domestically and regionally is very important to understand the broader region. And thank you for providing that. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. And that's it for today's episode of the Amargi Mosaic. Until next time, take care.